Hey everybody, what's up from Pokemon Classics, reminding you that the classics never go out of style. Or do they? I guess that's the topic of today's video, as I've been watching this debate unfold and sort of evolve in social media circles, as a number of PokeTubers out there that have talked specifically about investing debate the age-old question of which is better, vintage Pokemon cards or modern Pokemon cards. Now, for me personally, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this question, and in fact, I think the question is flawed in some ways. But in this video, I seek to get to the truth about finance PokeTubers, like myself. In my mind, it's not just a question of whether vintage or modern is the better play, it's more of a question of context and data. And that's something every PokeTuber needs to take into consideration when informing an audience, is to be able to back up their opinions with actual facts. More importantly, I think it's the responsibility of every YouTuber out there that's making this type of content to make sure to acknowledge the risks, because the risk assessment piece is so important for every individual, and it's going to vary from person to person. So strap yourselves in for this video as I give you my take on the truth about finance PokeTubers. Perhaps the oldest question in the Pokemon market is which is a better investment vehicle, modern Pokemon cards or vintage Pokemon cards? And in truth, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution to this question, and that success can be found on a number of different avenues. I've watched a number of debates online. Recently, Pokenomics has done a two-part Q&A series talking to different collectors about the value of vintage and the value of modern, with tons of dissenting opinions, alternative perspectives, and I think that's great. That is a wonderful thing for the hobby to have these different perspectives, because ultimately, rule number one about the Pokemon market is that it is a diverse market, and within it there's the existence of several submarkets. Of course, it's important to understand that every one of those submarkets is going to have its own unique supply and demand threshold, and really the success of collecting isn't just buying blindly into one of those areas and expecting it to benefit you, but rather understanding those market dynamics in each one of those respective categories. For example, in Modern, you have the playable cards, which will have their own rotating basis of supply and demand depending on which cards are competitive and what the rotation schedule is for those cards. Similarly, you have those collector-based cards, and that's going to be an element of scarcity and pull rate. And then, of course, you've got those trophy cards, which are pretty timeless, and really the population and availability of those is so low and the demand is so high that naturally that's going to be a bit safer in terms of liquidity, desirability, and not having to worry about a number of graded copies suddenly flood the market and creating this massive imbalance between supply and demand. So when it comes to Modern, the point that I'm making is there are items that are absolutely collectible, highly desirable, that fit within the realm of Modern. And you're hearing that from me, somebody that doesn't really collect Modern. But still, we can't throw it out entirely. There's definitely value there. Of course, the same is true for those that collect vintage cards. There are a number of collectors out there that prefer raw cards. One of the benefits here is that the supply is a bit more stable than it is for Modern. There's not nearly as many boxes in circulation, and without the additional worry of new reprints coming out in the immediate future. Many of these sets were printed 20 plus years ago, so that's just one less factor to consider. There's also those that collect vintage graded cards, and here the supply is a bit tricky. Typically it's fairly stable, but like we've seen in the last couple years, it wouldn't take much for people to suddenly send a massive influx of cards to a grading company like PSA or CGC and have those cards flood the market at relatively the same time. And then we've got the big kahunas in the market, your SM Pratts, your TCA gamings that are after the big stuff, your trophy cards, your exclusive promo cards. And again, that's an entirely different part of the market, but all these places coexist, and success can be found in any one of those areas. In my personal opinion, it's a dangerous gamble simply to buy an item because a YouTuber told you to, whether it's this Pokemon item, or that sealed product, or this graded slab, whether they tell you it's going to 5x, 10x, 50x, negative x, x squared, y-axis, whatever type of value you want to assign to it, unless there's some data to support that, and you feel comfortable understanding that data and the broader context in which that market is operating, you're likely going to be in for a bad time. Because as we've seen, every product within Pokemon fits a certain sub-market with its own rules, principles, and fundamentals governing it. Without understanding that, well, it's not really an investment, is it? Now, I hope this doesn't offend any of my fellow PokeTubers out there, because I know a number of those individuals, and I have nothing but respect for all those in the hobby, including those that I disagree with. but I think it's absolutely important for us that are making these types of financial investment videos to back up our recommendations with the rationale behind it. Some data, some historical context to help educate the viewer instead of just blindly saying, hey, these are the items that you need to buy. Lastly, I think it's important to note that any investment strategy is basically operating under the same principle: buy low and sell high. And this can be done in any number of ways with any number of products, which is why I think the whole conversation about whether vintage is king or modern rules supreme is fundamentally flawed, because there are always going to be deals that you can find on those vintage cards, the sealed ones, the graded ones, the sealed product, where you're buying low below market value and eventually finding some appreciation later. Similarly, that can be done with modern in a number of different ways, whether it's with identifying those playable cards that are then going to be used for decks and for battle formats, or finding products that are undervalued that might appreciate over time and getting in at a good entry point. Ultimately, it's all about understanding those entry points, the downside risk that comes along with it, looking at historical performance, just understanding the market in a much more intimate way. So anyone in the comment section that's really gung-ho about it, that says vintage is the only way to invest in Pokemon, well, that's oversimplified and it's just not true. On the other hand, those that talk modern is the way, vintage is the thing of the past, leave it behind, it's a dinosaur, that is also, in my mind, flawed reasoning. But we'll get into that. Perhaps my biggest criticism of Pokemon investment YouTube channels is the lack of actual substance. In my mind, the gold standard for a Pokemon channel is one that actually explores the historical context of the items that it's discussing, but also provides the background price data to justify those conversations. And I think this was Pokenomics that said this in one of his live streams, but he mentioned that it's not so much about understanding what the prices are, but rather why those prices are what they are. And I think that is absolutely profound and something that a number of channels don't always do, or if they do, it's secondary to their other purpose, which is just throwing the suggestions out there. And as we'll see in a moment, the market context makes an absolute world of difference to understanding what's happening more broadly. Now, there are a number of different sites that provide Pokemon analytics in terms of prices and populations. There's sites like PokemonPrice.com, eBay, PSA Card keeps a running total of sales, and so the price data is widely available. But I also think it's important to understand the historical price movements and the larger things that are happening within each era of Pokemon. When you start understanding that, you can see some of the cyclical patterns that emerge within the market itself and contextualize that data in a way that makes more sense, rather than simply cherry-picking numbers from different years. Let me show you what I mean. In the last 10 or so years, we've seen a cyclical pattern within Pokemon, really involving 3 different phases. More of a linear growth phase where things were happening more organically as prices picked up, but not in a very meaningful way. It was steady, stable growth. We saw this in 2011 to 2015, which I like to consider more of an establishing phase for the Pokemon card market, as we had YouTube coming into its own right with different PokeTubers entering the stage, online media platforms like E4 for people to discuss and kind of bring collectors together. PSA grading was becoming more prevalent, and all of those things had a positive impact on the trajectory of Pokemon. But it wasn't until 2016 that we experienced the first major hype phase around Pokemon Go, the 20th anniversary, and this is when prices shot up astronomically. Everyone in the world had suddenly gained exposure to Pokemon, and naturally, the card game, the TCG, exploded right along with it. Of course, when something explodes rapidly like that, it's got to come back down to earth. And that's what we saw from 2017 to 2018 was this downward phase, this rebalancing, stabilizing aspect, as all the cards were figuring out what their prices should be based on whatever the populations were, the availability was, the demand. It was a time to sort of figure everything out. This pattern absolutely repeated again in the last few years, as 2019 saw another linear growth phase, as once again, after the downward pressures from 2017 to 2018, prices were once again on the rise, interest was growing in a more organic way. Cue ahead to 2020, and boom, we were right back into the hype phase, with mania unlike anything we've ever seen, even greater than 2016. This is due to social media influencers like Logan Paul, stimulus checks coming out of every orifice, just funneling into the market in a way nobody could have expected, pandemic shutdowns, 25th anniversary of Pokemon, and everything was to the moon. Predictably, here we are in 2021 going 2022, couple years later, and we're dealing with the fallout of that, as once again a stabilizing phase is needed to figure out what should these cards actually be valued, what is the current demand for them. This is a cycle that plays out over and over again. We've seen it twice now, at least in the time that I've been collecting graded cards, and I think we'll see a return eventually to that linear stable growth phase. Now, I use this illustration simply to demonstrate the importance of historical context. Any individual out there, any PokeTuber, could easily cherry pick data from just one of these phases to really support any narrative that they wanted to. If they wanted to portray certain items as being a bad investment or negative, maybe data is selected from 2017 and 2018 when prices were going down without any regard to what happened immediately before in 2016 when everything exploded and it had to correct and stabilize. Inversely, if somebody wanted to show a product to be a good investment and make it seem like this hype train that can only go up to the moon, maybe they pull data from 2020 when everything was going up. This is why education and experience matter, because it's not just about the price data that you're given, but being able to understand why those prices were doing what they're doing. That's the difference between investing and flipping, just hoping for the best. And sometimes that happens to the best of us. For those of you that don't know Rudy of Alpha Investments, he had to learn this lesson the hard way when he invested an entire bathroom full of sealed modern Pokemon cards. Now, originally, this seemed like a great value. He bought them all below MSRP, and this was during the height of the 2016 boom. But what he wasn't expecting is that downward pressure and that stabilizing phase when prices dropped dramatically, and he couldn't move any of that product. So it sat in his bathroom for quite a while. Now, because he sat on it for so long, he did eventually make massive returns when the growth cycle returned in 2019, and then again, another boom in 2020. But until that point, it was nothing but sorrow and heartache for Rudy. Needless to say, I think the underlying lesson here is that any good Pokemon investment channel will provide you with historical context of the market in addition to the price data. When you put those two together, you have quality content, at least in my opinion. Lastly, I wanted to wrap up this video by acknowledging something that I don't think a lot of Pokemon YouTube investment channels do a great job of, and that's risk assessment. Now, this is another point made by Jake in his live stream video, but ultimately risk will vary from individual to individual. Not every person has the same risk tolerance or risk threshold or the same level of discretionary income to spend on Pokemon cards. And this is especially problematic, I think, when PokeTubers offer financial guarantees saying, if you buy this, I guarantee it'll X this much or it'll produce this much profit. Especially since we can't control all the macroeconomic factors and the large market cycles that we've seen earlier. You know, whether a set's going to be reprinted. You also have to take into consideration some of the unpredictable expenses like the taxes, the liquidity of buying and selling, the different fees that are come along with that. And a lot of times that's not talked about by different YouTubers. It's also important to note that what happens for one individual isn't always easily replicatable for others out there, or replicatable at all, because anyone really can make the purchase, but it's the experience necessary of knowing how to find those purchases, what price entry point to get into, what the market dynamics are going to look like, when to exit, and that's the more subtle, nuanced piece that sometimes is missing. I also wanted to acknowledge that there is no right or wrong way to enjoy Pokemon. The whole debate about modern cards versus vintage cards to me has always seemed silly. It's an either-or fallacy. It's not like only modern cards can be successful and appreciate over time, or only vintage cards can be successful. Whether you enjoy collecting modern sets in a binder and pulling cards personally from booster packs, or maybe you love graded slabs of vintage cards and you're creating collections there. Or maybe you're one of those people and you just enjoy flipping 5 to 6 figure trophy cards. There are going to be opportunities everywhere for investment as long as you have the knowledge and the experience to know how that market operates and to make those educated decisions on when to buy in and when to sell. There's no right or wrong answer. Let me just leave you with this takeaway. The key to investing in Pokemon cards isn't knowing simply which items to buy because some YouTuber told you to. Rather, it's about understanding the market dynamics and having the education to successfully operate in the hobby. And the more exposure you can get, the more experience you can get, the more fun you're going to have, and the more successful you'll be. Anyway, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this video. I'd like to know what your thoughts are on the whole PokeTuber finance video situation. I really enjoy watching that type of content, even when it's the type that I don't necessarily agree with personally. If you can back up your decisions with some data, with some history, I'm all in. I love that kind of content, and we don't all have to agree. Again, there's more than one way to enjoy the hobby. Anyway, guys, that's where we'll leave it off with this one. I'm Pokemon Classics, reminding you that the classics never go out of style. Unless they do. Anyway, we'll see you with the next video. Till then, stay well, everybody. Have fun collecting.